And so before you can even start to ask what causes CCCA, you have to believe that there's a biological basis of disease. And so when you put the onus on the patient and the blame on the patient, then in reality, you're saying, well, if you didn't do this, this would not occur. And we're really not seeing that in our patients.
Welcome to Dermatology Weekly by MD Edge, where we bring you the latest in dermatology news and clinically relevant peer-to-peer conversations each week. I'm the voice of MD Edge Podcast's Nick Andrews. This week on Peer-to-Peer, Dr. Vincent DeLeo welcomes Dr. Crystal Aguh to talk about central, centrifugal, cicatricial alopecia. That's coming up after the news. This week in dermatology, how technology, social media, and doctors are helping to raise awareness for those with albinism all over the world. Kari Oakes covers dermatology and a bunch of other stuff for MD Edge. Kari has reported that a dermatologist-led nonprofit organization has entered into a partnership with the UN to achieve global progress towards greater inclusivity for people with albinism. Kari, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you doing, Nick?
I'm doing pretty well. So this is a pretty crazy story. Let's start with the New York Times piece, which seems to have jump-started all of this. When I read it, I thought I was reading the plot of a movie. What was your reaction?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of amazing because that's a rewind to a story that came out many years ago that highlighted just how awful the plight of people with albinism in Africa is, because people who have no or little pigmentation in their skin are already set up for bad skin cancers and a lot of other things, especially in such a sunny climate where outdoor work is the norm. But the part that I hadn't realized was the stigmatization and really awful maltreatment that still happens in the 21st century for a lot of people who have albinism.
That New York Times feature story made waves around the world and inspired one New York dermatologist who still reads the physical paper.
I read that article. It was a full page and a half, and I still have that paper.
That's Dr. David Colbert of the NYDG, or the New York Dermatology Group, an A-list practice in New York City.
That's what brought my attention to it. And I knew from that point that there was a lot we could do from New York City. And I remember just calling the head of our NYDG Foundation and saying, I have a new project for you.
And that new project was simple. Find out how many people in the world have albinism, where they're most at risk, and what those risks are.
I think he read the story and he already had been sort of activated to do mission work from work he had done in Haiti. And so he sort of knew the influence and importance of physicians becoming involved. And he had a friend who already had a track record for leading international nonprofits, Stefan Bognar. And so the two of them buddied up and started a nonprofit that really is focused on inclusivity and helping people both in Africa and the United States who have albinism.
Albinism is more common by a factor of 10 in certain sub-Saharan African populations, like Tanzania and Malawi, compared with worldwide prevalence. And as we already mentioned, people with albinism are attacked, maimed, even killed for their body parts, which are used by traditional witch doctors and ceremonies designed to generate wealth and good fortune. And it is said that raping women with albinism is thought to cure AIDS, HIV, and infertility. But what could a few philanthropists in New York City really do on the other side of the world? Here again, Dr. Colbert.
We identified things that we could do to help, which was, sunblock clothing, sending sunblock, creating safe houses, and even more important, doing diagnostics with the local practitioners. If most people die between 20 and 40 of skin cancer, if we start young, none of them will die of skin cancer, and that was our goal. So we did some teledermatology clinics where we had a local nurse show their skin, show lesions, and then make recommendations for what needed to be done.
And as Kari explains, the New York Times article was not the only piece of media jumpstarting albinism awareness.
So it's kind of amazing because there's another big media story that gets looped into this. There's a famous, incredibly talented National Geographic photographer whose name is Stephanie Sinclair. She did also a big spread, I think it was called The Hunted, about the plight of people with albinism in parts of Eastern Africa. So she learned more about how these people are stigmatized and even hunted down for their body parts, which are thought to have magical properties. In the process, through the whole thing, she wound up adopting 2 children from Africa with albinism herself.
Wow.
Stephanie lent her services to a beautiful photography series that highlights both models and also her own children in this campaign to elevate awareness and celebrate diversity and promote inclusivity for people with albinism.
Right. And now the United Nations is involved.
The United Nations took these images and actually has signed a formal agreement with the NYDG Foundation and is using the colorful FULL campaign as part of its global campaign.
The Colorful campaign is a perfect example of media and art working together to raise awareness. But there are also other physicians that are doing boots on the ground work in Africa.
I was in Milan, Italy this past summer and saw at the World Congress of Dermatology, they had a little nonprofit village where they highlighted work of various nonprofits around the world. And one of these actually was called Standing Voice. There was a physician named Andrew Sharp who was raised in Africa himself, lives in the UK most of the year, but he and his physician colleagues do boots on the ground work in Africa, teaching non-dermatologists, even non-physicians, how to treat people with albinism, how to prevent and manage skin cancers as they occur. And also they do a lot of awareness raising and really important nitty-gritty work in Africa to help the lives of individual people with albinism. Dr. Colbert's group does some of this as well. From talking to each of them, it's a big space. Nobody is competing. There's a lot of work to be done over there, and everybody has sort of found their niche.
The plight of people with albinism is not new in Africa, but this awareness campaign kind of is. Kari explains that there's one massive reason why. Dermatology lends itself to visual media and social media.
This is an example of a confluence of people who have knowledge, people who have influence, and also the reach and spread of social media. A model, Deandra Forrest, who is African-American, who has albinism, and she has really become activated. She has a really great social media presence. And so she's helped sort of boomerang this into Instagram, and it's really taken off there.
There is, of course, a larger theme to all of this work, and that is that it is important to do philanthropic work, according to Dr. Colbert. Kari says it's been something that's quite important to him and quite fulfilling as well.
Not everyone is going to go to Africa for weeks and weeks, but that everyone has bandwidth for a little bit of help. And he said it might just be something small you're doing in your community, going and giving a talk about sunscreen protection, working with an athletic team to make sure that they are all wearing their shade protection. And that's work that dermatologists can do.
My message would be like, don't try to solve all the problems of the world. Pick something that you're passionate about. I was passionate about albinism, and I felt with my contacts and with our foundation that we could actually make a difference. Every little bit that anybody does helps. Again, pick something you're passionate about. Don't try to knock it out of the ballpark, but make a small difference. If everybody's making a small difference in their favorite charity, a lot of work gets done.
You can read more about the New York Dermatology Group, all of our albinism reporting, and more at mdedge.com/dermatology, and you can find links for background reading in the show notes. I'd like to thank Kari Oakes for participating in this report. Dermatology Weekly will be right back with Peer-to-Peer, Dr. Vincent DeLeo.
Today we're going to talk to Dr. Crystal Aguh about central centrifugal cicatricial alopecia, or CCCA. Dr. Aguh is from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in Baltimore, Maryland. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Aguh. I once heard you speak, and as the cliche goes, I was blown away. So much of what you point out in the literature blames the victim about the disease CCCA. And you don't say that activities by affected individuals can add into the process, but you do start a whole new conversation. Can you give us the history of what was the pathophysiology of this disease?
Absolutely. So one of the first things I noticed in training when I started seeing patients with CCCA is that they would often tell me, look, I know I did this to myself. And that wasn't necessarily true. And these patients were reflecting what they had been told previously by doctors. When CCCA was first described in the 1960s by Dr. Lopresti, it was initially called hot combed alopecia. And hot combing was a very popular style among Black women in the 1950s and 1960s who were looking to straighten their hair. And as hot combing became less popular, but CCCA persisted and women moved more towards the use of chemical relaxers, it then became called chemically induced alopecia. And that was basically because chemical relaxers were the style du jour. And as chemical relaxers have fallen out of favor, now women have been told that weaves and extensions and braiding, which were not common in the 1950s and 60s, are contributing to CCCA. And what was happening was that because we were attributing this form of hair loss to styling practices that women were using, there was no incentive to actually perform investigative research into the pathogenesis of this disease. And so before you can even start to ask what causes this, you have to believe that there's a biological basis of disease. And so when you put the onus on the patient and the blame on the patient, then in reality you're saying, well, if you didn't do this, this would not occur. And we're really not seeing that in our patients.
What do we know about the pathogenesis of CCCA?
It's a great question. I tell a lot of people that I really feel like the past few years have been the dawn of a new age in CCCA research. So really what we know has started to take off, but there's still so much we don't know. So one study that I and my colleagues did at Hopkins, we actually looked at the gene expression pattern in patients with CCCA. And what we did is we took samples of affected scalp and CCCA and unaffected scalp, and we basically were able to perform microarray analysis and see what genes were upregulated in affected scalp. And we did see that there was a pretty significant overlap between the expression pattern seen in CCCA and other scarring disorders such as uterine fibroids, as well as hepatic fibrosis and idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. And what that tells us is that this scarring process is very similar to other diseases of systemic scarring. And that's really starting to shed light into the presentation of this disease. We additionally did a study where we looked at the rate of uterine fibroids in Black women with CCCA and Black women who don't have CCCA. And when we did a retrospective analysis of several thousand women at Johns Hopkins, we saw that women with CCCA were 5 times more likely to have uterine fibroids than Black women who did not have that form of hair loss. And so again, that kind of speaks to this potential systemic process. More recently, a multinational group published a study in the New England Journal of Medicine that showed that a gene called PADI3 is upregulated in patients with CCCA. And this gene has actually been implicated in another hair disorder called uncombable hair syndrome. And while the PADI3 gene is responsible for hair shaft formation and is not really involved in the scalp and the skin, it may clue us into pathogenesis because it may signify that disorders of hair shaft formation may subsequently lead to the abnormal scarring that we see in these patients.
Can you describe the genetic component a little more?
So as I mentioned, the PADI3 gene was recently published. Even though we know about that gene, we still don't know about the inheritance pattern. I will say from an anecdotal perspective, when I talk to patients, I would say on the range is maybe 1/5 to 1/4 of patients do notice that they have family members who seem to have a similar scarring process. And so there are many of us in the hair loss research community who do believe that for some patients this can be an inherited condition. The New England Journal of Medicine study did not particularly look at the inheritance pattern, but that is an avenue for future research.
What other areas do you think should be the focus of future research in CCCA patients?
So I think highlighting the inheritance pattern is going to be very, very important. I think also identifying additional gene variants that may be present in CCCA will be important, because even in the New England Journal of Medicine study, that PADI3 mutation really only accounted for about a quarter of patients. So we're not quite sure what's going on in the other 75% of patients. Additionally, it would be really, really important, I think, for us as a research community to understand the systemic implications of CCCA. One of the reasons I felt like the fibroid study was so important is because it really moved CCCA away from just being a purely aesthetic disease. And I think as dermatologists, this is something that we can all appreciate. We understand that our research takes on greater significance to the medical community at large when we can say, hey, the skin and the hair is really kind of a window into what's going on systemically, and this disease is really important, not just because the patient feels like they don't look the way they want to, but because it can adversely affect their health. And, with uterine fibroids, there are women who are getting early hysterectomies, early myomectomies, and so there's certainly systemic implications, and I think we need to really understand that link a little bit more. And then lastly, I think the ultimate goal for everyone would really be to identify a treatment option for patients with CCCA. Right now, the standard of treatment is the use of topical or intralesional steroid injections. Now, in practice, the results can often be disappointing for patients. For one, we know going in that intralesional steroid injections are not meant to promote regrowth. They're really meant to minimize progression. The unique issue about CCCA is that unlike other scarring alopecias, you cannot reliably use erythema or inflammation as a measure of activity. Many patients with CCCA have no clinical evidence of activity. So whereas we can reliably tell our patients with lichen planopilaris or frontal fibrosing alopecia or discoid lupus, hey, we're going to do these injections and we're going to do them every 8 to 12 weeks, and we anticipate that maybe after a year of treatment, everything will burn out and you won't require future treatments. With CCCA patients, some of these women are getting intralesional steroid injections every 8 to 12 weeks for 8 to 12 years, and we still can't tell them that it's okay to stop because we really are unsure if it's working or when it's necessary. And so I think kind of increasing our treatment arsenal for these patients will be really important. Intralesional steroids are very, very uncomfortable, as many dermatologists know. And so I think that's a very important goal to have for CCCA given its unique presentation.
How did your passion for CCCA research and education begin?
So it's really funny because when I was a resident, I really had no idea what area of dermatology I would focus on, and I kind of felt pretty sure that I would not do CCCA. It just seemed like such a depressing disease. Patients were super enthusiastic, but I felt so disappointed with the lack of treatment options. But the thing that kind of changed my perspective on disease was really that initial piece that I talked about putting blame and guilt on the patient. I just didn't buy that these women who all had a variety of hairstyles, some of whom had never relaxed their hair in their life or had never used any form of extension in their life, all of them were presenting the same way. And I didn't feel honest in my recommendations because it was one of the few conditions in which I would present recommendations that really weren't backed by robust research, just kind of anecdotal evidence. And so I felt that it would be important to me to look into it further so that I could counsel my patients better. And the further I looked, the more intrigued I became, and the more excited I became to see these patients and offer them new treatment options. And kind of, I tell my patients, I say, look, we have a long way to go, but stick with me. And, I promise you at some point we're going to figure this out. And it's been really, really rewarding, and I'm so happy to be doing this work.
Dr. Aguh, anything else for our listeners about CCCA?
No, I really think we covered it. I'm really glad and honored to have this opportunity to talk about the disease. And my hope is that, even within a matter of 2-3 years from now, we'll know so much more about CCCA and have so much more to talk about.
And that concludes this week's episode of Dermatology Weekly. If you like Dermatology Weekly, please leave us a rating and a review. We love those 5-star ratings on Apple Podcasts. You can find Dermatology Weekly on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Pandora, or wherever you prefer to listen. For Dr. DeLeo, MD Edge editor Melissa Sears, and all of us at MD Edge, I'm Nick Andrews. Thanks for joining us for Dermatology Weekly.